All right. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of our audience, depending on where you're calling in from. Half of our staff is overseas as well. So good evening, good morning to all of you. I'm Jenny Town. I'm a senior fellow here at the Stimson Center and director of our Korea program in 38 North. This is one of our 38 North events that we're very excited to do to highlight some of the research that we've been working on over the past few months. But just to say, first of all, if you missed yesterday's event, we did do a takeaway about the Putin-Kim summit, and the video is online. You can find it both on the archived event page or on Stimson Center's YouTube channel as well. And we'll pop it in the chat for you also. So yeah, today is another great opportunity to engage my Stimson colleagues, my 38 North colleagues in discussion on important trends in North Korea and what this could mean for North Korea's strategic thinking. We'll be looking specifically at North Korea's emphasis on rural development in the recent years. Where does it come from? Why now? How does it fit into broader economic or even military goals? And what have we been able to observe about the priority and sustainability of this initiative from both North Korean domestic reporting on it, as well as our own satellite imagery analysis? So the discussion, like I said, is based on research we've been doing over the past several months now with generous support from the Uni Korea Foundation. The first 4 reports are on 38 North already. Again, we'll pop those links into the chat for you to see, to find them easily. And the final installment will be going up later today. And so we want to thank Uni Korea for supporting this research and enabling us to do something rather niche, but with potentially important implications about how Kim Jong Un is positioning himself to the people and why that's important. So to walk us through all of this, I'm pleased to introduce you to my team here at the Stimson Center, or at least half of my team here at the Stimson Center. Rachel Min-young Lee is a senior fellow here in our Korea program in 38 North. She was a North Korea collections expert and analyst with Open Source Enterprise. And most recently headed engagement and network building efforts at the Vienna-based Open Nuclear Network. Martin Williams is a senior fellow also here in our Korea program in 38 North. His primary interests are really in North Korean technology, infrastructure, broadcasting systems, and propaganda. He launched the North Korea Tech website in 2010 and has closely followed the country's steps onto the global internet. He previously worked as a technology journalist in Japan for 16 years. And Ileana Ragnon is our research associate here at the Korea program, and she's also our producer for 38 North. Prior to joining Stimson, she was a program assistant for the Foreign Service Institute, and she holds a BA in International and Area Studies in Chinese Language and Culture from Washington University in St. Louis. As usual for our audience, if you have questions along the way, please feel free to put them in the Q&A box at any time, and we'll work them into the discussion. But to kick us off and help us better understand what's happening on the rural development front in North Korea, we will turn now to Rachel.
Thank you, Jenny. Good evening from Seoul. I will be providing the context of North Korea's ongoing rural development project, and I'll leave the satellite bit to my colleagues, Martin and Ileana. So I'll attempt to contextualize this project by providing an overview of Kim Jong Un's rural development initiative he launched in December 2021, and by reviewing some potential challenges to the project's success. To start with an overview of how the project was launched. The Rural Development Project was launched in December 2021, but it really has its roots in the 8th Party Congress that was held in January 2021, when rural construction and agricultural production were addressed as key tasks. Then, during a party plenary meeting at the end of that same year, in December 2021, the party adopted a quote-unquote new program for socialist rural construction, and this was modeled on Kim Il Sung's Rural Development Project in 1964. The stated goal of the project was to increase agricultural production and improve farmers' standards of living. The adoption of this new program followed Kim Jong Un's speech, a significant part of which was dedicated to agricultural issues. The unusually heavy focus on agriculture at this meeting was understandable, given that in June of that same year, when the country was still in self-imposed lockdown to prevent a COVID outbreak, North Korea acknowledged a food crisis. The main points of Kim's new program are, first, raising the level of farmers' ideological awareness. Second, changing the grain production structure of the country to rice and wheat. Previously, it was rice and corn. Third, systematically increasing the state's investment in agriculture. And fourth, and last, modeling all rural villages on Samjian City. North Korea followed up on the launch of this new initiative by enacting a string of farming and rural development related laws. And these include the law on development of city and county, the law on supplying cement to the construction of cities and counties, the law of the DPRK and socialist rural development, the law of the DPRK in agriculture, law of the DPRK on the farm, and the law of the DPRK on irrigation. This is slightly going off on a tangent, but still relevant. Another major economic project that we should be tracking alongside this new program on rural development is the Regional Development 20 by 10 policy, which many of you may have heard of. This 20 by 10 policy was launched in North Korea in January 2024. And it mandates the establishment of local industrial factories in 20 counties per year for the next 10 years. If the rural development project is aimed at closing the gap between the cities and rural areas, the 20 by 10 policy is aimed at closing the gap between Pyongyang and the rest of the country. So going back to the agriculture program, one notable takeaway from Kim's new program is that it is designed to strengthen the state's control over agricultural production and the party's role in rural development. The emphasis on the county level management committee's unified and planned guidance over agriculture and the party's guidance over rural development runs counter to Kim Jong Un's reform initiatives across the agricultural and industrial fields, because the essence of his reform is that it's meant to give greater latitude to individual economic units in planning, production, and management of resources and profits. So it was probably not a coincidence that since early 2022, just in the wake of the launch of this new program, North Korean media have significantly scaled back on the use of the plot responsibility system within the sub-work team management system, which is Kim's key agricultural reform initiative centered on smaller scale incentivized farming. Centralization has been one clear trend in North Korean policies across the political, economic, social, and cultural spectrums since the collapse of the second US-North Korea summit in Hanoi in early 2019. As reviewed above, a closer reading of Kim's new program, launched in December 2021, and subsequent North Korean media handling of Kim's key market-oriented initiatives indicate that the North remains on a path of centralization and reform-oriented measures remain stalled at best. So giving greater management rights to smaller farming units and individual farmers reportedly had some impact in increasing productivity. This suggests that reinforcing control over smaller farming units and individual farmers could have negative consequences for morale and productivity. For this reason, North Korea's centralization policies need to be tracked carefully for their implications for the country's agriculture and rural development campaign, despite its official goal of increasing production and improving farmers' livelihoods. So my presentation ends there, and I'll be happy to discuss more during the Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. It's a great way to contextualize what we're seeing, that this isn't a necessarily new out of the blue initiative, but certainly greater emphasis has been placed on this in recent years. Well, let's now turn to Martin to figure out where are we now and what are some of the major themes that we've been seeing in the implementation of this initiative.
Yeah, thanks, Jenny, and good morning, good evening to everybody on the call. When we started looking at this and started looking at the reality of what was going on, one of the first things that we did was we started trying to plot all of the places where this new rural housing was being built. For the last couple of years, it's been a fairly regular feature on North Korean TV, the opening of new houses, and almost coming up so often that it kind of blended into the background. And certainly I didn't realize how big this project was. It was also sort of not, the scale of it wasn't initially clear either, because unlike some of the other recent projects, like the project to build 50,000 apartments in Pyongyang over 5 years, or the 2010 plan that Rachel was just talking about, there was no numerical target given when this plan launched. Kim Jong Un sort of said that he wanted this modernization to extend to all villages, but there was no numerical target for the number of villages per month or per year or anything like that. So we started tracking these. And this, for me, was sort of one of the most interesting and fascinating parts of this work. We identified over 190 locations since basically the beginning of 2002, where this new housing has been built. 147 locations we actually geolocated on maps, on satellite imagery. And there were an additional, I think, 43 locations that had been mentioned in North Korean media, but we didn't manage to geolocate, either because they were too difficult to find or because we didn't have up-to-date imagery. But the vast majority we did manage to geolocate. We put them on a map, and it sort of looked like it was a random distribution across the country. There was nothing too nothing too special jumping out. But then what we decided to do was, rather than put dots on the individual locations, we put dots on the counties that each of them was in. And we do have a graphic in one of our stories. And this shows that most of the new housing projects, initially anyway, were distributed so that there was one project per county. So these were very deliberately widely spread across the entire country. The reason for this is probably partly to do with the way that the instructions for building these houses kind of went down through the different national and provincial and county level organizations. This is the map we've got. You can see that most of North Korea's counties, the vast majority of counties, have seen at least one project. A few in the middle there, very mountainous areas, haven't seen them. And then the other areas, most of the other areas that haven't seen many are actually built up areas that aren't really part of the focus for this anyway. But even on the outskirts of Pyongyang, in the rural areas of Pyongyang, there have been some of this work going on. I think this is also partly because, if you're living in the countryside and if you're consuming North Korean media, you've been seeing for several years continuous reports about these great new high-rises going up in Pyongyang, these marvelous apartments being built, these new factories going up in different parts of the countries. But in your little village, what's changed? Probably not very much. And I think by spreading these developments out county by county, it means that even if nothing is changing in your village, somewhere in your county, there are new houses going up. So you probably know that there are houses going up. So I think it makes this policy seem, much closer to home for most of the North Korean people. So I think that's a deliberate part of the planning. So we went on then to start looking at some of the different places where these were being built. And, as it's rural development, all of the housing basically fell into two different distinct areas. They were either being built in small rural villages or in farms. A lot of large farms in North Korea have their own housing. So some of the work was replacing some of that housing. The types of houses that were going up were interestingly architecturally different in different regions of the country. So they weren't working off, say, you know, a set of 5 different blueprints and just building the same houses everywhere. Different parts of the country were seeing different houses. The houses on the surface look all very nice. They look quite modern. They've got large windows, pastel colors. Ileana is going to show some examples of some of this in a minute. But pretty much all of the new housing was either single-story houses, which usually would be split so that 2 families would occupy them, or they were multi-story, up to about 4 stories, multi-dwelling units, which were basically you know, a small number of apartments. And that kind of depended on the setting and where they were put, but it really was just an answer into how many people needed to be housed. So there wasn't a real pattern into where these were being used, but we saw mixes everywhere as well. There was the single-story housing alongside the apartments. The single-story housing, people usually got gardens. They were things like fruit trees were in the gardens already. We noticed that most of the housing, at least in the TV images we saw, there was electricity hookups to these areas, which would make sense because, you know, you don't want to replace old housing with you know, equally out-of-date housing. Electricity supply in North Korea is a constant problem. So just because there was an electricity supply to the place doesn't mean they always have it. But, you know, that was probably at least a step forward for many of these people. And in many cases, what they did was they demolished old housing and built the new housing on the same plot. They were not finding new pieces of land to build the new housing and then move people over. So for, you know, anywhere from, say, 6 months to 1 or 2 years, people were forced out of their homes, presumably to live with other families nearby before they got to move into their new apartments. A few of the other sort of notable trends that we saw in all of this before we go on to some of the specific examples. Usually when houses were demolished, they left some of the civic buildings. You know, most North Korean villages have a small number of civic buildings, a culture hall, which is sort of dedicated to the study of the Kim leadership and the North Korean system and things like that, some monuments maybe. Those were usually left alone. The houses alongside them were demolished. In some cases, new civic buildings were built, including things like, you know, rural health clinics. And then also in some areas, hillside propaganda was added above the towns. We have some examples and some photos in some of our stories, but just to give you a sort of taste of some of the slogans. In some villages, we have things like "Long live socialism" in large concrete letters on a hill above the town so that the people in the town can look up and see that all the time. Others were a bit more on point towards the actual program itself, which was things like, you know, towards a new victory in socialist rural construction. So that's some of the main themes we saw. And I think Ileana's got some concrete examples along with some images of some of the stuff we've been talking about.
Thanks, Martin. And just again to remind our viewers, if you do have questions, please feel free at any time to put them in the Q&A box. We're happy to discuss this more, questions or comments. And let's now turn to Ileana to see what we can see.
Great, thank you all. Thanks, Rachel and Martin, for kind of giving the lay of the land. I'm going to come in with some more examples of kind of illustrating the trends that Martin highlighted and kind of pulling it all together. Again, here is our kind of map of the housing distribution throughout the country. This was probably the most interesting part of the project for both Martin and I, was to kind of track this across the country and then dial in on some different examples in the country of what the housing actually looks like and what some of the construction patterns followed. So this example is of Solbong-ri. It's in Kosan County in Gangwon Province. this was a really interesting example that kind of encapsulated a few of the different themes that Martin mentioned in his little presentation. Here is the before image of the village. You can see where there is a monument in kind of the rural town center and a bunch of houses surrounding it. We noticed that as construction went on, you can see some of the footprints of the houses here, and you can see where some new things are starting to be built over the direct land that was demolished. But that middle part of the town where there was a monument and presumably some other sort of buildings or facilities that kind of correspond with government or the party, was left untouched during redevelopment. So that was left kind of as is. Another example is at the Oryu vegetable farm. You can see around this area there are greenhouses and other kind of farming buildings and auxiliary equipment. But here was another plot of land that had uniform housing that we kind of tracked over time. This was an example that was actually mentioned a few times in state media, which drove our attention towards it a little bit as an example that was kind of encapsulated what the project was intended to accomplish. So you can see here, again, leveled houses in the middle of the farming area. You can also see that there are a few buildings that remained standing, and then there are some beginnings of foundations and footprints for new houses as well in the plot. And this is also interesting as one of the trends we saw was a consolidation of housing. So we went from more single family dwellings to more consolidated multifamily units. And this, I think, is a really interesting example of that, to be able to house more workers around the farm. And to be able to kind of fit more families in one place. You can see just from satellite imagery alone, the variation in architecture styles, the various different types of buildings and housing, but it is placed on that exact same plot of land that the original housing was. Here's another example of houses kind of scattered throughout. This one is was done in a few phases, which was another trend that we noted, was sometimes the first part of the housing was redeveloped and then there would be a pause in the construction and then the party would go back in and maybe update some of the communal facilities and other buildings as well. But this was another one that we tracked over time from 2019, which was before the project, to 2021 at the beginning. You can see that some of the housing is different here as well, but the project really looks completely different in 2024. So some of these areas took a longer time to kind of develop and to become their full completion of the initiative. Here are a couple of examples of different architecture styles that we noted. It was really interesting as well as we were kind of carrying on in the project. There was an article in KCNA that talked about how different areas and different regions of the country were correlated to different types of architecture styles. So we were confirmed in our theory that, in our hypothesis, that different styles of apartments kind of were seen throughout. So here is a picture from Korean Central Television of multi-story dwellings, which is something that we typically see. There were also a few different displays of different types of architecture, so you can really see the variety of different housing here. There's a few single-story units, and some of the single stories still have multiple housing connected to one another, as well as different more modern architecture styles, which we found pretty interesting as we were looking. Here is another example of the first satellite imagery of Solbongri. You can see the gardens outside of the single-story homes mixed in with the multi-story architecture as well, which we thought was interesting. And here's an example of the propaganda that we saw scattered throughout villages. This one was more overt and kind of on the ground, but other times it was hoisted up on the hillside. And this is the one that says, "Towards a new victory in socialist rural construction at a vegetable farm. So this picture with the different architecture styles and with the propaganda talking about the specific farm and really kind of encompasses what we have seen throughout this initiative. And I believe that is all from me. Happy to chat more about questions.
Great, thanks, Ileana, and thanks to all of you for kind of laying out the what we know so far. I wonder, Martin and Ileana, if you could talk a little bit more about the methodology of how did we identify these 160 different projects around the country? Is there a way to distinguish what's happening under the Rural Develop Initiative versus other initiatives like 2010? Is rural development all about housing, and the 20 by 10 is more about industrial factories? Or what are the parameters here that you're working with? Martin,
I'll go ahead and start, and Martin, you can fill in what I've missed. But in terms of methodology, we did a lot of combing through state media, both on TV, through news, and some of the news outlets, Rodong Shimbun and KCNA. And we really took note of every single time that there was mention of housing being built or a move-in ceremony, or anytime that there was some kind of farm that was housing new workers or kind of going under construction. And we cataloged all of those. We looked through some of our internal data to see what we had already identified. Otherwise, we poked around a lot on Google Earth and other platforms to kind of track over time where we can see movement and where we could see houses. As you can see from some of the satellite imagery, they look very distinct from above. They're usually red, white, and blue on the roofs, and they kind of take a different form than what some of the other more traditional original housing did. So we did a lot of identifying in that way, and then kind of tracked our coordinates and pulled it all together. In terms of the difference between the 2010 policy and the Rural Development Initiative, something that I found from our work, and Martin, I'm not sure if you had a different experience, but North Korean media was very overt about saying when something was related to the 20 by 10 project, and because that came later on in this initiative in 2024, it was pretty easy to determine that anything that was kind of built beforehand that was mentioned as part of rural development was from this unnamed initiative as opposed to the 2010 policy. So I think that that's something that we were able to easily track and differentiate between the two.
Yeah, not much to add. All of that, yeah, totally concur with. I'll just add that you know, we did a lot of tracking of TV and state media because North Korean you know, state media has been very, very good about reporting on the move-in ceremonies that happen. There's been less reporting on the building of these different houses than we saw, say, with the projects to build the 50,000 flats in Pyongyang. That was a very large year-long or maybe sort of year and a half long project. There were lots of reports on construction in the capital city, on what people were doing. We saw a lot less of that sort of intermediate reporting, but pretty much almost every time one of these new housing complexes is opened, there is a news story and there are accompanying TV images. At the ends of the years, the construction seems to sort of take about 6 to 9 months, depending on the project. There are exceptions, but sort of 6 to 9 months is average. So towards the end of the year is when a lot of the move-in ceremonies are. Last year, I think in December, for almost sort of 2 weeks solid, there was every single day move-in ceremonies in different places across the country. So TV and state media was kind of key in doing this. I don't think we found anywhere that hadn't been mentioned in state media, but that was the way we did it. It's been a very big sort of push on the propaganda side from the state media, I think, to show the North Korean citizens that this project is large and it's working, and it's bringing new homes to people all over the country, which is, probably a big part of the reason why it's being done anyway.
Rachel, would you have anything to add, especially to that last point, in terms of the propaganda value of this project? Obviously, the amount of media coverage that it's getting is, I think, unusual, especially for rural areas, and the focus on rural development is not something that would necessarily make the news every day in the past. So, if you could just kind of talk us through more about, what does this tell us about the propaganda messaging and the messaging that Kim Jong Un is trying to present?
So this came up earlier. I think Martin may have mentioned it. So these projects are very visual, right? They're big projects. Whenever you make progress, you can see the outcome of the progress, right? In the form of buildings and houses. So they make really good propaganda. It's a really good way of telling the people, look, this is how many buildings we've built, how many houses we've built. It doesn't get any better, right? Because they're very visual. They have that effect of, it just makes it easier for the Kim regime to tell the people that this is how much progress we have made. Look at all these nice things that we're doing for you. It's a really good way to raise people's loyalty, I guess, if you will. I would say that the level of just the sheer amount of coverage, media coverage we're seeing is unusual. But again, this rural development project and also the 20 by 10 policy that we mentioned earlier are the two top economic projects, right? They're the top twin economic projects. So that's really where the focus is. So in a way, it does make sense for them to give that much coverage. I would say, though, that as we are talking about the amount of coverage, we also need to think about where Kim Jong Un's attention is, right? Where he's focused on at the moment. Because if you look at the public appearances made by Kim Jong Un, right? Just going back to January 2024, the number of visits, his public appearances have largely been focused on the military side, as opposed to the civilian economy. He has made a couple of appearances in 20 by 10 policy-related projects, but otherwise, overwhelmingly on the military side. So, what does that tell you about where the focus really is for North Korea at the moment? And, that also brings me then to the point of, why, where it kind of, since we're talking about just the heavy volume of coverage we're seeing about these projects, yes, they're top projects, economic projects for North Korea. So yes, it makes sense for them to give this much coverage. But on the other hand, it's almost kind of like bending over backwards in a way, to almost atone for all of the attention that they're paying also to the military side, all of the investment that they're making in the defense industry, the munitions industry as well. That's probably another way that you can look at it.
That's really helpful. I wonder, Martin and Ileana, if we could go back a little bit in terms and look at what you've seen in satellite imagery about how these new projects are being constructed, the process itself. For instance, if we're looking at major construction projects in Pyongyang or in the tourist zones, you'll see, the workers' communities, the temporary workers' communities get set up. If we're talking a period of, say, 6 to 9 months in terms of construction for these villages, one, do we have any sense of where they're putting the people they're displacing as they raise the communities and build new ones? Two, are we seeing any patterns in terms of construction workers where they might be to give us a sense of how long that construction is actually taking? And three is really also, is it just housing, or do we see anything else that would help improve the area, such as investments in infrastructure around those areas as well?
Yeah, before I answer those questions, let me just add a comment to what Rachel was just saying, because it's something I forgot to mention. She made a very good point about Kim Jong Un's visits. I don't think we've seen Kim Jong Un attend any of these housing move-in ceremonies or any of these projects. The forerunner to this was the big project in Samjeon, and we certainly saw him turn up at Samjeon a few times. But Samjeon is a very different city. Well, it's a city for a start now, but also sort of for North Korea, it's a much more important city because it's the gateway to sort of Mount Baekdu. These are rural villages, so you might not expect Kim Jong Un to turn up, but as this is a sort of major project, you also might expect him to turn up to at least one or two, but I don't think we've seen him at any. So that's a good point that Rachel brought up. In terms of your questions, Jenny, yeah, one of the things we saw, as I said, almost everywhere was, and we saw in Ileana's graphics, they tended to level the housing first and then build new housing on top of that. I'm not sure where those people went. We didn't see temporary buildings put up, either for the people that were displaced or for the workers. In fact, we need to remember, we can't even be sure that the people that were kicked out of their houses were the ones that moved into the new houses. It's quite possible that there was, a reevaluation for who gets the new houses. But I suspect probably what happened to the people that were kicked out in the meantime, some of these places were things like farms. They were still needed to work on the farms. So I suspect that they were, some of the remaining houses just had to take in the people. And for 9 months, you had 2 families living in one house or something. As for the construction workers, I'm not sure where they were coming from. Again, maybe they were sort of living on site somewhere in some of the existing buildings. But we didn't see the same kind of sort of logistical operation that we've seen in some of the much bigger projects that have been going on in North Korea. In terms of sort of outside of the housing and other sort of facilities or infrastructure, certainly in a lot of these rural areas, the spaces between the houses, the sort of streets or roads or alleys, some of those have definitely been improved. They are no longer just sort of dirt tracks, but they're now, some of them are concrete, some of them are paved, some of them are gravel. It's difficult to see a lot of that detail from satellite imagery. So for that, we rely on the TV images. And the TV images, of course, are only showing the nice size of things. It's the same with things like the electricity. We see lights on in the TV images, but how long the lights stay on or how many hours a day there's electricity, we don't know. There appears to be running water, or at least there are taps in the kitchens. Whether the water comes out of that continuously or at all is unclear as well, because we can't see that from space. We don't see it in the TV imagery. So these are all things we need to kind of consider when we're looking at what's being done here. As I pointed out, in some of these, we have seen things like health clinics go in, rural kindergartens or schools or things like that. So some of these towns are getting small updates to their civic services alongside the housing.
Ileana, is there anything you wanted to add to that?
No, I think Martin pretty much covered it. Just that we didn't notice anything in the surrounding areas. It was kind of interesting. It just looked like an isolated incident of one specific tiny area was changing, but everything else around it was staying the same. So yeah, not sure where all of those people ended up being sent.
So a lot of questions coming in really are about the quality of the housing. So it's one thing to see the exterior. And I think in the article going out later today, we talk about how most of the TV coverage is really about the move-in party itself, the ceremony, and not the inside of the buildings. And it reminds me of back when they were rebuilding the Komdok mining community after the floods, and how they were, pointing to this housing push to create these new houses. But there was a lot of anecdotal evidence that people were unimpressed, and that the quality was really in question, the services were really in question, the location was still undesirable. I wonder, Martin, you've talked a little bit about the things we don't know. I wonder if you could, if you've seen anything in like things like Daily NK or Asia Press, anecdotes that might have come out about these new housing projects, of anyone who has had any contact with them, or any reviews of them.
Yeah, I mean, the housing quality is sort of one of the huge unknowns about all of this. Exactly the same for these big new apartment buildings in Pyongyang as well. They look amazing too. Just look at the images last week when, Putin's motorcade was sweeping through Pyongyang, and massive tower blocks with their lights on. The city looked amazing from the outside. There have been reports from Pyongyang in some of those publications with people complaining about the quality of the buildings, and also, things like having to get up to, if you live in a 50-story apartment building, then it seems that in North Korea, the most desirable apartments are the ones on the second and third floors, because when the elevator doesn't work, you only have 2 floors to walk up. That's been from Pyongyang. Definitely, there's a lot of the building materials are made domestically in North Korea, except for that sort of one building, maybe 10 years ago, the skyscraper that collapsed in Pyongyang. We haven't had any reports of building collapses, so I don't think there are sort of very fundamental structural problems with this kind of stuff. But one of the things, that is noticeable is that some of these houses have large windows, and if you're in a cold area, that's a lot of heat you're losing. And if you don't have good, consistent heat, maybe the apartment gets very cold in the winter. Interestingly, once or twice, and in fact, recently, I think I saw this earlier this week, there was coverage of a new housing opening, and I think it was the roof of one of the buildings had been blurred out by KCTV. KCTV has begun blurring out things they don't want us to see. And it was curious about why they blurred out the roof of this one building in this whole town. So I don't know what was going on there. Obviously, we don't know because it was blurred out. But that might hint at it not being as sort of photogenic as the rest of the development. But the quality is a big, big question. Having said that, of course, even if the quality is sort of mediocre, it still might be better than the houses that people moved out of. So even, it is still potentially a sort of upgrade in the housing, even if it's not fantastic housing by sort of international standards. So we kind of, I think, have to think about it in 2 ways.
Have we, on that note, in some of the other construction projects that have gone on, especially during the pandemic era, there's been a real push on people to do their part and to contribute to building materials, and for regions to contribute to building materials. Have we seen any kind of push like that, any kind of propaganda push like that, about the housing, about this rural development initiative and the housing that they're building now in North Korean media at all? Maybe Rachel, have you seen any of this?
I think there's continued push for local production, finding raw materials and other materials that are that you can find in your own region. But I think the local production recycling campaign really peaked in 2021, 2022, when the country was still in lockdown, and when trade with China was limited.
One of the questions that have come in is, and again, Martin and Ileana, as you're looking at the imagery and you're looking at all of the move-in day ceremonies and hours of propaganda, are you seeing patterns of we've talked a little bit about how the architectural styles and feel are localized, right? But are we seeing kind of patterns of like this style is more common in this area? Is it based on topography? Are you seeing any of that, or is it mostly just to make each kind of unique?
I can have a go at answering that. It's not a great answer, though. I would love to have compared architectural styles across 147 locations that we identified, but it was just too much. So we did notice that different styles. It was noticeable that every time we looked at this, it wasn't, oh, these are the same buildings. They were obviously all very different. Some of the styles are regional. For example, in fact, if you go back and look at, say, the buildings that were built up in Samjeon, it's an area that gets very heavy snow, as does most of North Korea, but especially the northern parts of the country. So you would see then, the very sort of classical, very very steep roofs, to help the snow fall off in the winter and things like that. So you'd see some of those differences. Beyond that, yeah, we didn't do a very detailed analysis of these styles by region. But state media has said multiple times that the styles do vary by region. Maybe that's our next part of this research, is to start delving into exactly whether that's true and how they differ.
Yeah, interestingly enough, the most recent article, and I think the most overt mention of it about the different architectural styles by region came out while we were in the middle of this project. So it was something that we had noticed, that the styles were different, that there was no kind of one size fits all, but we hadn't noticed a pattern of specific areas to specific types, but that kind of confirmed that there was maybe some kind of pattern.
And for our audience, who most don't have access to a lot of satellite imagery, you've been able to map out these locations that have been mentioned as to where they are in the country, but how much imagery is there of all the different locations, especially in those rural areas, and especially within the last 2 years, for instance?
Not a whole lot. I think a lot of times satellite imagery coverage of North Korea is concentrated on kind of the buzzy locations and kind of the sites that are talked the most about, typically related to the WMD program, which does present a little bit of a challenge when we're trying to look at more economic-driven projects throughout North Korea. So that was kind of part of our research as well, was noting where there was enough imagery where we could track kind of over time the development of certain buildings and certain types of rural development projects. But sometimes there just wasn't anything. And I think that is kind of evident with the ones that we weren't able to concretely identify, the 43 or however many, was because there's just not a breadth of imagery. There's not a ton of daily or regular coverage of the kind of inside of the country. It's more focused on kind of the major sites.
Great. We do have a comment and a question from Andrew Yo at Brookings Institute. He says, first of all, fantastic research. When Kim Jong Un announced new housing starts and an emphasis on the agricultural sector at the 8th plenum meeting, he was skeptical that the regime would be able to achieve any of this under the pandemic, border lockdowns, and sanctions. Yet it seems that the regime has defied the odds. Surprise, surprise. So he asks, do these new housing starts suggest an improvement in the quality of life in North Korea compared to pre-pandemic times? With Kim's centralization of the economy and the return of Russian aid to North Korea, it appears that North Korea is returning back to the Cold War, when North Korea was better off economically and the Kim regime carried greater legitimacy. Would you agree with this assessment? And what does that mean moving forward for US policy towards North Korea? And I think, Rachel, we will direct that one to you.
In terms of whether the houses suggest an improvement in the quality of life, The propaganda wants us to think so. But we talked about this earlier about the questions surrounding the actual quality inside these houses. I think it's questionable whether, they're quality houses. So I guess I guess the answer really is that we don't know. But the propaganda wants us to think that the quality of life has improved and that the regime is doing all it can to improve the people's livelihoods. And this goes back to Kim Jong Un's people first politics. He's promised the people that he would improve the people's standards of living. So he has to make good on that promise. And again, the housing projects are a great way to prove that he's making progress on that front because they're so visual. In terms of Kim's centralization, the return of Russian aid, whether North Korea is going back to the Cold War, I'm not sure what brand we're going to attach to where North Korea is returning or where North Korea is going. I think we need to look at this in terms of North Korea looking for a plan B, like an alternative to what used to be its US centered foreign policy where it was pretty much focused on normalizing relations with the US and by doing so, improving the economy. With a guarantee for regime security. Those days, I think, have passed. And I think North Korea found Russia as a reliable partner. I think we saw that playing out last week with the summit, with the treaty. I would say that in terms of what this means for the US and North Korea policy, I think it's really bad. It looks bad, at least for the foreseeable future, because I don't think that the US has much leverage. Whatever political, diplomatic, economic leverage the US might have exercised vis-a-vis North Korea, I think most of that is gone, if not all of it, for the time being, because I think North Korea has, for the time being, found a workaround through Russia, and it will continue to look for other workarounds by looking for other partners as well, in addition to Russia, because as we all know, North Korea doesn't like to put all its eggs in one basket because of its fraud history, especially given its complicated history with the Russians. I think that they're looking for a longer-term relationship with the Russians, but I think North Korea is too smart to know that nothing lasts forever. And at any rate, I don't think that the US is in the picture, at least not for the foreseeable future.
And certainly we discussed that a bit yesterday as well in our takeaways from the Putin-Kim summit. And I think that's a pretty palpable theme throughout. We do have a couple more questions. One is, again, Martin and Ileana, thinking about the concept of the blurred roof. Have you seen any evidence of solar or thermal paneling being used in any of these new constructions? Other than that, what kind of heating systems do you think these new rural buildings rely on?
Yeah, it's a good question. Solar heating or even solar electricity panels will be something very easy to put on these buildings. I don't think we've seen a single building with any of that installed. Certainly it exists in North Korea. So it's interesting that they haven't put any of that on these buildings. As for the types of heating, historically, I think most of these rural areas have relied on electric heating. A lot of them have relied on, poor power supply and individually owned solar panels and that kind of thing. I don't know that this is going to be any different. We certainly haven't seen any evidence of any large-scale heating systems, and the propaganda hasn't talked about any of that side of things. But like we said earlier, A lot of the coverage of this has been around, especially on the move-in day, shots of the outsides of the buildings and of the festivities that happen in the village when people move in. Very little visuals of inside the apartments. We've got a few pictures of inside the apartments in one of our stories, but a lot of it has been focused on outside, so they haven't been showing the insides very much. So that's the sort of area that we don't know very much about.
All right, and then one final very specific question. And that is, you showed the picture of when they showed the different architectural styles that have been employed. Is there any information that's been given on the actual architectural firms or construction firms or contractors that the system has been using to complete this project?
I did not come across any of that, though that would be really interesting information to glean from this project to see if that kind of varied by region as well. Martin, have you seen anything of that sort?
No, just in terms of architecture, there is the, I'm trying to remember the name of it, the Pyongyang School of Architecture, the University of Architecture. It's often featured in North Korean media. And they, I think, are the people that came up with the designs for the buildings. They come up with the designs for most of the buildings in North Korea. But beyond that, not really much discussion of any of the sort of work units involved, any of the other organizations that are part of this. So no, nothing specific on that.
Okay, great. And kind of one final question, and Rachel, this will be to you, and it deals with, obviously with the Russian partnership, this means the US has less leverage. Does this apply to China as well? We've seen, North Korea really prioritize Russia. Is there room or still an opening, do you think, for China to play a bigger role or have greater influence on North Korean affairs?
I think China has less leverage now if we're talking about the leverage that China is willing to use. I think there's always more that China can do and could have done, but just hasn't and will not do, which I think North Korea knows as well. So in terms of the leverage that China has hitherto been able to exercise, I think that's decreased, yes, because of what's going on with Russia and North Korea. But in terms of North Korea-China relations, I think there's always room for North Korea going back to China at some point, shuttling back and forth between China and Russia, as we saw back in the Cold War.
And certainly, as we talked about a little bit yesterday too, there is a difference between leverage and influence. And so, that's always been the case with China in dealing with North Korea. So I want to thank our panelists. It's always, like I said, great to work with and feature our 38 North team. And I want to thank all of our participants for joining us today for a very specific discussion, but one that, again, hopefully has potential implications about how we understand North Korea today and how it's evolving. So hopefully we will see all of our guests again at future events, and we